Good day. Let me begin by thanking the meeting organizers for inviting me to participate in this forum. I'm greatly pleased and greatly honored to be able to talk to you on the topic of Tai Chi and mental ability. I have no conflicts of interest for this presentation. I want to begin by talking about normal brain aging, or what I refer to as cognitive aging. The factor psychologists talk about mental abilities in two different buckets. One is based on crystallized abilities. These in turn represent acquired skills, knowledge, and experience built up over a lifetime. And fluid abilities are based on memory and learning, and also on a set of skills referred to as executive functions, abstract reasoning, problem solving, changing of set, response inhibition, and so forth. This slide depicts two different graphs taken from a study of the NIH Toolbox on Cognition. And these graphs show two examples, one of crystallized abilities and the other of fluid abilities. Looking at the graph on the right-hand portion of the slide, we're looking at measures in different age groups on a vocabulary test and a reading test. These both represent crystallized abilities. And you can see that during early childhood, there's an improvement in score, such that by age 20, the scores are much better than in younger children. And after that point, scores continue to improve up until middle age, after which there is a plateauing even up until the 9th decade of life. This is in contrast to fluid abilities, where there is an initial improvement, but then a decline over the lifespan. The left-hand portion of this slide shows performance on a memory test, one aspect of fluid abilities, showing increased performance in the different age groups up until about age 20 or 24. But after that period, there's a decline in performance, and the decline doesn't begin, as you see, in late old age. It doesn't begin in middle age, but it begins in relatively young adulthood. And this is true for other kinds of cognitive skills, including executive functions. There are other changes that occur with aging that aren't normal in the sense. There are a number of different pathologies that affect the brain, particularly in late old age. This slide shows autopsy diagnoses in over 500 people who died as part of the religious order study at Rush University. The average age at the time of death was 90 years in this analysis. And the investigators looked at brain changes representing different neurological diseases. As you can see here, over 2/3 of the people had changes that are likely to represent Alzheimer's disease, the plaques and tangles of Alzheimer's disease. About a quarter of people who died had changes of Lewy bodies, the kinds of changes seen in Parkinson's disease. Nearly half had a visible or microscopic stroke, and over half had a different form of vascular pathology. And a substantial minority had changes referred to as hippocampal sclerosis, where the underlying biochemical abnormality is the accumulation of a protein inclusion referred to as TDP43, TAR DNA binding protein 43, seen in hippocampal sclerosis, as well as some other age-related diseases. Now, these changes don't occur in isolation, or they often don't occur just in isolation. As you can see here in this overlapping Venn diagram, Alzheimer's pathology can occur by itself, but it more often overlaps with the other pathologies. And the same is true for stroke, for example, or other vascular disease and so forth. Most people by age 90 have multiple pathologies. Only a few have zero, and only a minority have just one of these different pathologies. So this is a different sort of process that occurs during aging and that affects cognition, which is different than the cognitive aging that are referred to in the preceding slides. There is interest in Tai Chi, understandably, as an intervention that is likely to have beneficial health effects. I did a PubMed search using the medical subject heading terms of Tai Chi and cognition, and identified 78 articles. Not a huge number, but certainly it demonstrates interest, with about 10 articles in this topic being published and identified each year. Narrowing this down to Tai Chi and dementia or Alzheimer's disease, I was able to identify about 30 articles, with maybe 3 or so being published each year now. Looking at cognitive aging ties in very closely with the concept of cognitive reserve. Cognitive reserve refers to the extent to which mental function can be maintained in the setting of aging or in the setting of diseases that affect the brain. It implies that there is a greater capacity in the brain, or perhaps greater efficiency or redundancy in some sense of the word, in terms of brain areas and nerve pathways used during cognitive performance. This concept has been particularly promulgated by Jakob Stern at Columbia University, and this figure on the left-hand part of the slide is taken from one of his studies where he took a group of Alzheimer's patients, matched them for dementia severity, and looked at a measure of cerebral blood flow in relation to education. Education is one of the paradigmatic indicators of cognitive reserve. And looking at blood flow in the temporal parietal regions, the areas shown in blue here, dark blue showing the largest reductions in blood flow. For people who had been equated on the basis of comparable dementia severity, having greater education meant that there could be a greater degree of reduction in blood flow, presumably reflecting a greater degree of pathology within the brain, compared to people with less education. So more education enabled better performance relative to the suspected amount of underlying pathology. And in fact, this relationship has been looked at more directly in the same religious order studies that I referred to a minute ago. This is a study that follows older people over time with annual cognitive assessments. And these data are based on autopsies in 130 people. There is an overall measure of Alzheimer's disease pathology based on neuritic plaque counts, the numbers of diffuse plaques, and the numbers of neurofibrillary tangles. And this is aggregated into an overall score that ranges between 0 and 3. Looking at cognitive function, and here this is a composite measure, a standardized score where 0 represents sort of an average normal score, +1 would be one standard deviation above that, -1 would be a standard deviation below that. And if you take a certain degree of brain pathology, and let's say a level of 2, for example, and then see what the cognitive function would be on average in this grouping, for the higher education group, there would be a score of maybe -0.6 or 0.7 standard deviations. But for people in the lower education group, the cognitive score would be -2.1. So more than a standard deviation difference in cognitive performance, given the same degree of Alzheimer-related pathology. So this ties in very closely with the concept of cognitive reserve and suggests that education is one fairly powerful marker of this particular concept. Now, cognitive reserve is something that's assumed to occur over the lifetime. Perhaps early childhood is more important than later adulthood. We don't know that. But enhanced childhood environment is thought to play an important role in building cognitive reserve. Mental activities, including higher education, but also including mental activities as part of more mentally demanding professions and in terms of mentally stimulating leisure activities could play a role. There are a number of studies that look at physical activity, and part of the putative cognitive benefit of physical activity is related to the concept of cognitive reserve. And there are certainly studies in animals, but also humans that would support this association. There are mindfulness interventions related to stress reduction, related to meditation and other activities that might be used to enhance cognitive reserve. Social engagement, group interactions, having a life partner, these activities have been associated with better cognitive reserve. And it's likely that nutrition in different ways also enhances brain function and cognitive reserve. And certainly there are others that would be related to this topic as well. So there is a great deal of interest in Tai Chi and similar kinds of activities in relation to various health outcomes, including cognition. I'm showing here results from a recent meta-analysis looking at the effects of Tai Chi or Qigong on cognition in various neurological disorders. This meta-analysis was based on randomized controlled trials, and there are different ways of trying to gain scientific evidence, but a randomized controlled trial is really the best way to try to establish causality. These aren't perfect studies. There are ways that randomized controlled trials can have biases or lead to incorrect inferences. But that said, it's still the best kind of study to try to establish a causal relationship. If one engages in Tai Chi exercises, does that cause an improvement in cognition? So clinical trials are really the gold standard when these can be done. This particular meta-analysis looked at various neurological disorders, including mild cognitive impairment, but also dementia of various types, Parkinson's disease, stroke, multiple sclerosis, epilepsy, traumatic brain injury, and cerebral palsy. And they were looking at various cognitive outcomes, but the primary outcome was based on measures of global cognition, and they reported results for the mini mental state examination, for the Montreal Cognitive Assessment, the MOCA, or something called the mini Addenbrooke's Cognitive Examination. There were 40 eligible trials. Tai Chi was used in 18 of these. And the right-hand portion of this slide shows a forest plot looking at these global outcomes for the mini mental state examination. And here the mean standardized difference was 0.2. This is an effect size. It refers to the number of standard deviations improvement. So 0.2 is fairly small, but also not trivial. It's something that would be clinically meaningful, I think. For the MOCA, the standardized mean difference was 0.82, a larger effect, which no doubt would be clinically meaningful, assuming it's a valid estimate of the effect of the intervention. For the mini Addenbrooke's, the effect size was smaller, actually fairly close to null. But overall, the overall effect size was 0.64, about 2/3 of a standard deviation, and this is enough to be clinically important. This slide shows a different meta-analysis, and here we're looking at the association of Tai Chi and cognition among community-dwelling older adults with either normal cognition or mild cognitive impairment. So here's where I have sort of a greater personal interest, at least in the context of this presentation, looking at cognitive performance in healthy older adults. This particular meta-analysis looked at various cognitive outcomes, not just global cognition. The authors identified 16 eligible studies, 7 of which were randomized controlled trials, and the overall effect size was similar to what I suggested in the preceding slide based on neurological disease of 0.66. Again, an effect size which, if valid, is likely to be clinically meaningful. Now, not all of these studies were randomized controlled trials, and I'm showing the listing of those that were randomized controlled trials. One of these was based on mild cognitive impairment, but even so, you can see that the trials tended to show a benefit in favor of the Tai Chi group, maybe not quite as robust as the overall 0.66, but certainly enough to take to be noticed and perhaps to be quite important. Identified one other randomized controlled trial in the literature that wasn't included in the meta-analysis that I just showed. And this was a study that was conducted in Taipei. It involved older adults who had a history of a fall, average age 72. And this was larger than the other studies that I've shown so far. There were 2 groups, Tai Chi and a strength and balance comparison group, 228 participants in each group, a 6-month intervention with follow-up at 18 months. And the outcome was a fairly simple measure, the mini mental state examination. And the difference at 6 months was in favor of the Tai Chi group, but it was quite small. It was 0.1 points, probably not enough to be noticeable. But at 18 months, the effect seemed a bit larger, 0.6 of a point. And here we're starting to get into the range of a benefit that would be interesting and perhaps clinically important. We've also conducted a randomized controlled trial looking at Tai Chi in healthy older adults. This was a study that we referred to as the ACE senior trials, the activities for the cognitive enhancement of seniors. We didn't start out with the intention of looking at Tai Chi per se, but we ended up examining that. We wanted interventions that would be inherently interesting and valuable, that would be potentially sustainable over time after the intervention had stopped, that could be implemented and maintained in a community-based setting after the trial was over without the need, for example, of specialized equipment. And we wanted interventions that seemed more complex because there is evidence to suggest that more complex interventions are more likely to enhance cognitive reserve and be beneficial. And so these are the kinds of considerations that we had. And for the physical activity intervention, perhaps no surprise to this group, Tai Chi exercise emerged as our leading candidate. Tai Chi is estimated to consume about 3 to 4 metabolic equivalents, and with a similar level of exertion between older and younger practitioners, depending on age. A metabolic equivalent, as a reminder, is a ratio of metabolic rate to a standard resting metabolic rate. So 3 to 4 mets means about 3 to 4 times the amount of energy expended compared to lying on a couch. And it's thought that Tai Chi consumes roughly the same amount of energy as brisk walking, or perhaps moderately brisk walking. We wanted an intervention that was more mentally based, and we came up with a particular form of autobiographical writing. We had a combined group that had both Tai Chi and autobiographical writing, and we had a control group. This was an active controlled group based on successful aging seminars, attending a seminar, but where the involvement was more passive than with the other interventions. The amount of contact time was equal among the 4 different interventions. So the combined group, for example, got a little bit less Tai Chi than the Tai Chi alone group, and a little bit less autobiographical writing than the autobiography group. Participants had to be at least 70 years of age. The average age here was 78. We recruited 137 individuals without mild cognitive impairment or dementia based on baseline neuropsychological assessment. We required participants to, at least by self-report, be relatively sedentary. And the 4 groups were those that I've mentioned already: Tai Chi, autobiographical writing, Tai Chi plus autobiography, and successful aging seminars. This was a 6-month intervention, and it was followed by a 6-month maintenance period where participants were exposed to some of the original intervention, but at a much lower dose to maintain their interest. And the primary cognitive outcome was based on a composite of memory tests and executive function tests. And for those of you who have a neuropsychology background, these are the tests that we used. The executive function tests were letter number sequencing and the trail making test part B. And the other task was the interference condition of the Stroop task. For learning and memory, we used the sum of immediate recall trials as one measure. For the Hopkins verbal learning test, we used delayed recall as the second measure. And the third measure in this composite was the Benton visual retention test for a nonverbal measure of memory. The characteristics are shown here. Average age about 78. More women than men, a well-educated group. The global cognition is measured by the modified mini mental state examination test. A 0 to 100 point measure was between 95 and 97, so everyone was scoring near ceiling on this. And we helped to exclude mild cognitive impairment using a story memory task, a logical memory task, where the average scores are shown here. And this is the outcome of our trial. After 6 months intervention, the Tai Chi group showed the largest improvement. This is roughly a change in Z-score, standardized mean difference of 0.3, a fairly large effect size. The combined group Tai Chi plus autobiography did nearly as well, and the other 2 groups did less well. The comparison group, of course, is the seminar group. Unfortunately, Some of these results weren't maintained at the end of the maintenance period. There was a fall off in the Tai Chi group, still performing better than the seminar group, but not quite the dramatic difference that we thought we saw at 6 months. These are the same results, just shown numerically. The yellow represents the combined cognitive measure that was used for the primary outcome, memory plus executive functions. And you can see change from baseline in the Tai Chi group from memory plus executive functions and broken down by memory, executive functions, and global cognition. And at 12 months, you can see the same breakdown. Memory seemed to be pretty well maintained at 12 months in the Tai Chi group, but not executive functions. So what can we conclude from this particular randomized clinical trial? Well, the ACETA results show that Tai Chi may remediate cognitive aging in older adults without dementia or mild cognitive impairment. These findings are in line with other findings from other small randomized controlled trials looking at Tai Chi in healthy older adults. But the full sustained effect in Tai Chi for people learning for the first time may require more regular contact with an instructor or a group setting after the initial learning phase than we were able to provide in this 6-month trial. The overall conclusions, Tai Chi does seem to help improve cognitive function in midlife and older adults. The fact that we seem to have demonstrated that doesn't give us the underlying mechanism. But for Tai Chi, it seems likely that these different aspects that we think are important for cognitive reserve are involved. Tai Chi, again, is an aerobic activity. It involves learning of a set pattern of movements. It's certainly a mind-body mindfulness activity that has other independent benefit. And it usually is taught by an instructor, often in a group setting and practice in a group setting. And for many practitioners, then there's the social engagement aspect. The underlying biological mechanisms require more study. There's some evidence that Tai Chi will enhance BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic factor, which in turn has been related to synaptic plasticity in the brain. There are functional MRI studies that suggest some differences in neural connectivity that might be beneficial, but there's still a lot to be learned in this regard. So with that, let me thank you again for the kind invitation to be here and to participate in this forum. I would like to acknowledge the investigators in the trial that I presented to you, and particularly Master Shudong Lee, who was the Tai Chi instructor and was so generous with his time and instructions in this particular study. I look forward to questions if we have time for those, and I certainly look forward to hearing the other presentations. Thank you.